Hello, welcome to Ask an Expert session with the European Environment Agency. Today, we are going to talk about zero pollution, pollution in Europe in general, and I have three guests. My name is Gülçin Karadeniz, and I'm from the European Environment Communications Program. And if my guests can briefly introduce themselves. Maybe we start with one of my colleagues, Ian.
Hi, good morning, Gülçin. So my name is Ian Marnane, and I work here at the European Environment Agency, specifically on this topic of zero pollution. So I've been working on this over the last year in relation to the report that we published last December. So this is one of the key roles of the European Environment Agency, to publish this type of information and knowledge to support existing and future European policies. So happy to be here today to talk about this.
Yes, we published a massive package, which also included contributions from the European Commission, from which we have the two external guests. Maybe we start with you, Joachim. Can you just briefly introduce yourself?
Happy to do so. Good morning, everybody. I'm Joachim Diogenio. I am a policy advisor for zero pollution in the European Commission, in the Directorate General for Environment. And there we have a whole directorate called Zero Pollution, and I'm advising there the director, and I've been involved in the same report that was already mentioned. I've been in the Commission more than 20 years now, and I've been working on different topics, starting from water, industrial emissions, marine, air policy also a little bit, but also had a chance to dip into other policy areas. And when the European Green Deal came along, it felt only natural that I was going back to work on pollution again because of my background and my education. So I'm very happy that I've been involved in this report, and I'm very happy to be here and discuss with you today this important piece of work. Thank you very much.
And we have a lot to discuss, actually. But Diego, you're also working in the European Commission, but in the Joint Research Center. So maybe you could also explain a little bit what you do and what the JRC, as we call it internally, does.
Yeah. So good morning, everybody. I'm also really happy to be here participating today in this event. So as Gülçin say, I work for the Joint Research Center, which is the scientific branch of the European Commission. I'm a marine scientist, oceanographer, working on the ocean and water unit of the Joint Research Center, and we work more on the outlook aspect of the analysis of the policy, using models to try to look into the future, to try to address what the environmental conditions in the European waters and seas are going to be under a certain set of assumptions for the future. We were working together with the EEA on the outlook part of the zero pollution report that was published in December. We cover not only water but also soil and air pollution. And we are really happy to have been involved in this very important piece of work.
Yes, we'll talk quite a bit about that. But as I said, this is a live chat, and we are here to answer questions from our live audience. So if you have any comments, questions, any kind of reflections that you would like to share with Ian, Joachim, and Diego, please do insert them in our LinkedIn streaming in the comment section, and we will ask your questions to our guests. But maybe before we actually go to the knowledge package, this massive report and series of reports that we published together in December, maybe we could talk a little bit about, zero pollution. Is zero pollution achievable? What is it? What are we talking about? So Joachim, could you just explain a little bit, if we can, what do we mean by zero pollution?
Yeah, happy to do so. So first of all, we have, of course, asked ourselves the same question when this kind of terminology came up. And in our Zero Pollution Action Plan, we have tried to describe it, to explain it in the following way. So we mean by that we want the pollution of air, of water, of soil to be reduced to levels that are no longer considered harmful to health and natural ecosystems, but also that respect the boundaries of the planets that we live in. And so this has a number of aspects, and it's a bit technical maybe, but I think what is important to say is we're not talking about that there are no releases to the environment. So there will still be some form of anthropogenics, let's say nutrients, for example. We'll still use nutrients, still use fertilizer that will still go into the environment, but it should be just at levels that are not hurting our biodiversity, that are hurting our animals, our plants, and ultimately hurting us as human beings. And the same goes for other topics, for the other pollutants. So of course, it's in the end, it can be a very technical discussion. We'll have to go into detail, but the important thing is that it's a direction of travel. It's a long-term objective. We've set that for 2050. It's an analogy to the climate neutrality that we want to achieve by 2050. And it's really about an endeavor, an effort to make that in many, many areas, I believe, is possible to do. But of course, science moves on. To give you an example on air quality, we had just recently new guidelines from the World Health Organization. And of course, we have to adapt our thinking about what zero pollution means in the light of any type of new evidence that emerges. So I would stop here for now, but I think it gives a little bit of a flavor of what that could mean. Thank you.
Yes, we will talk. I mean, you did mention air pollution. It's one of the pollution issues that has significant impacts on health, human health, and nature as well, which is one of the topics that actually the EEA's monitoring report has covered. But maybe, Ian, you could, we did say that it was a massive package and it consists of different components. And one of the key components was the European Environment Agency's Zero Pollution Monitoring Assessment Report. What does the report say? What do we look at more concretely?
Okay, thanks, Gulshan. So when we talk about the monitoring report, and Diego will talk about the outlook, but when we looked at this monitoring aspect, so we're really looking at how we've been performing in terms of how we're impacting on the environment or human health over the last number of years and where we are at this point in time. And then the work from the Joint Research Centre takes over then in the forward-looking piece. So if we look at how we've been doing in terms of the pollution that we've been causing over the last number of decades, we see that in some areas we're actually making significant improvements. One area that you mentioned already is in relation to air pollution and air quality, where air quality has been improving significantly over the last 10, 15, 20 years. So for example, one of the targets under the Zero Pollution Action Plan is that we reduce the number of premature deaths related to air pollution by 55% by 2030. So at the moment, it looks like we're on track to meet that target, for example. But even if we do meet that in 2030, we'll still be facing around 200,000 premature deaths every year as a result of air pollution. So we're going in the right direction. And we'll hit that target for 2030, but obviously we've still got a long way to go to meet the ultimate zero pollution target that Joachim talked about, and that's for 2050. So we're looking at 2030 as an interim measure. In some other areas we're not doing so well. Our performance has stalled a little bit. For example, if we look at the way that we consume raw materials or the amount of waste that we're generating, for example, which are also significant sources of pollution. We're not doing so well there, and the level of waste that we've been generating over the last 10 years has remained quite consistent. So it's been a very stubborn issue to try and address. Similarly with water pollution as well, that the trend has been relatively flat. So this is part of the objectives of the assessment, is to identify, where are we doing well? Where do we need to make some improvements in order to move towards that zero pollution objective?
We will talk a little bit about the impacts of pollution on nature and health and so on later on, but maybe Diego, you could say a few words about the outlook component that we just talked about, because Joachim was saying that this is a long-term kind of trajectory, this is the direction, and what do we know? Are we in the right direction? What does your knowledge say?
So actually, as Ian just said, we try to look forward from the moment that we are in time and trying to predict how the expected policy options that are already in place in the different legislations covering the soil, the air, the water quality in Europe will make us get close or not to the target that are set in the Zero Pollution Action Plan. So we in the outlook part there are three components. So we have the air pollution, water pollution, and the soil pollution. Obviously, everything is connected because the nature has no boundaries. So whatever happens in the air will finally fall into the soil, and then it will leak into the waters, and it will contaminate or pollute fresh water and marine water. So we need to consider the entire ecosystem as a whole. That's something that we are addressing by creating digital twins of the natural system in around Europe to try to track the source and the fate of the pollutants. And as I was mentioning, the idea is okay if we already have an idea of what is going to happen because of the different European legislations in the future, we combine that with the prediction of climate change, which is also going to be a very important stressor for our ecosystem in the future, and try to look at how much closer can we get to this target reduction, I don't know, about the 50% less litter at sea, or the nitrogen pollution in our waters, or the air quality in our cities.
So actually, this kind of knowledge is feed into the policy discussions and how we take this kind of objective into concrete measures, which is one of the things that European Commission is working on. We are receiving questions, which is great. We will start addressing them as soon as possible. But Joachim, can you just tell us a little bit what the European Commission's input to this package was and what else is happening in terms of policy developments?
Yes, pleasure. I think first of all, as probably the viewers know, we've set out this huge policy agenda, the so-called the European Green Deal in 2019, which is all about transforming our societies, our economies, and that includes the long-term objective of climate neutrality that I've mentioned. That includes of reducing and eliminating biodiversity loss, making our economy more circular, and it includes the zero pollution objective. And as part of this huge policy agenda, the Commission has identified quite a number of specific areas where we need to modernize our policies, where we need to move one step forward. And I think I will only mention some examples, because if I would mention all of them, we would fill the whole discussion on that. But of course, you can always ask for specific issues, and we can send you more information on certain topics, because there's really a lot is happening. But I think the ones that I want to mention are the revision of the Ambient Air Quality Directive. So one area is air pollution. Ian has mentioned that we have made progress, but we have not made sufficient progress. There's still enough pollution around that we have significant effects on our health. We have significant effects on our biodiversity. And the Commission has now, last October, come forward with a new legislation that will address the recommendations from the scientific experts, from the World Health Organizations, and that modernizes the instrument and get us not only a huge step closer to the target in 2030. We will actually, with this legislation, be able to go beyond the target, exceed the target. But we will also then make good steps towards the 2050 objective, and then we will review that as part of the monitoring and outlook report, how far we are actually getting with this. Other areas are water pollution, where we have come forward with a modernization of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, of water pollutants in groundwater and surface waters. We are working on a soil health law, so the same for the soil pollution part. And we are also addressing sources. So we have made proposals on addressing industrial emissions, on addressing emissions from cars, addressing emissions from pharmaceuticals and so on. So there's a number of areas where we mostly use our legislative powers, so put legislation in place. But of course, all of this is complemented by more research in the areas, by financing of activities, investments, of cleaning up our environment, and by basically putting the structures in place that allow us to step by step move from where we are now to the targets that we want to achieve by 2050. Thank you.
It is impressive in the sense that there are many different action areas, and the legislation tries to, as you mentioned, address the sources, but also the impacts. One of the things we talked quite a bit about air pollution. I will not go into deeper, but maybe we could, Ian, you could expand a little bit, because one of the components of the European Environment Agency's report was looking at this ecosystems. Pollution does impact nature, but how?
Yeah,
and why we should care about it.
Yeah, and this is an important question, because sometimes people look at pollution as quite compartmentalized, and for example, okay, the water is polluted, but how does that affect me? And one of the key elements of this zero pollution action plan and the work that we're doing is to show that, and something Diego mentioned already, is that pollution moves around within the environment and is not just compartmentalized in water. So if we think about, for example, wastewater or pollution from water that ends up in our rivers, and then this pollution can obviously impact on the ecosystem within the river itself, but then the river is flowing into the sea. This can impact on food and fish in the sea. So eventually it makes its way back into the human health system and into our food systems. So it's very much the same, for example, with pesticides. If we take another example of pollutants, that pesticides obviously are very important in terms of making sure that we have sufficient food for European citizens, but also then it can impact, for example, on pollinators, on bees. And we also do need bees to help in food production in terms of pollinating crops and plants. So again, the impacts that we have on ecosystems are very much related to impacts that we have on our health, and we can't separate those out. So, for example, the environment provides the water that we drink, it provides the food that we eat, it provides the air that we breathe. So by polluting the environment, we're effectively having an impact both on the environment and ourselves. So I think this is one of the key messages that we're trying to stress in the zero pollution monitoring assessment that we've been working on.
Well, thanks for the explanation and the examples. We started receiving questions. So for our live audience, if you do submit them in the comment section, I will ask them to our guests. And I like to start, because we are receiving some questions, I'd like to get to the questions. We have a question from Alexis, who works on sustainable finance, but he's more on the data. At least the question is on the data side. He says, please share your thoughts on data analysis, data provision by third parties, and data availability in general implemented in order to achieve regulatory needs and net zero goals and biodiversity impact. We had planned to talk a little bit about the data, but I think the data question goes quite hand in hand with targets. How do you set targets? So maybe, Joachim, you could clarify a little bit what kind of targets we are talking about. Most of them are reductions of some sort, and then we could take the data point that Alexis is asking.
Sure. Thanks, Gülçin. Yeah, so I think first of all, of course, we have a lot of data needs, but also we have a lot of data available, and we are using them in developing and monitoring our specific policies. So when, for instance, we talked about air quality or water, we have specific obligations in these pieces of legislation about what data are needed to specifically make sure that these policies are being implemented properly. But we're using these data, and the EEA is our main partner on this, to then address some policy questions and develop indicators and targets. And this Zero Pollution Action Plan has mainly focused on targets that look at the main areas of what pollution goes into the environment, so-called pressures. So what type of releases we have in the environment, and how can we reduce them, and by when. So the targets that we've set are for air quality. They are linked to human health on one hand, and to the ecosystems was already mentioned, and they're always percentage reduction targets if we were able to define that in more detail. We have then targets that address more the water soil angle and look also at the biodiversity aspects. We've mentioned nutrients and pesticides, for instance, so there are reduction targets for these, together with relatively new kind of topic that is more and more in the spotlight on antimicrobials. So pharmaceuticals that have antimicrobial properties and that more and more pose a problem also in the environment. We looked at the aspect of noise, again, a very important part of a factor for affecting our health. And it's also very important for citizens. A lot of citizens are concerned about the noise levels and so on. So that's another target. And then the third part is more looking into the question of production and consumption. So what about our plastic waste that ends up in the seas? So marine litter, for example, microplastics. And what about the waste production that we have in communities, in countries, cities, regions? Ian has already mentioned that there the progress is relatively slow. So we're linking basically these targets with these major policy areas of improving health, improving biodiversity, and moving towards a circular economy. That's the idea behind it. And I think that data, we have a lot, but I also want to say is you never have enough data. So I think there's always a question, how can we further improve data availability in there? I think modern technologies offer a huge opportunity to further improve the evidence base and the data availability also for the assessments that we're going to do in the future. But I think that's more a specialty of the EEA and the JRC colleagues.
Maybe we start with you, Diego, because you work also with a lot of models and the data that is behind the models. Do you have the data that you need? Or
well, obviously, as Joaquin said, we are always hungry for data because a model is only as good as the data you feed in into the tool. So there is a lot of data coming from many different monitoring exercises. The European community or the European Union in general, it's making a lot of effort in monitoring the conditions of our environment. So there is a wealth of data that we can use, and then thanks to mostly to the EEA that is making this compilation and curation of this data, we have access to this organized and homogeneous data. Of course, as I mentioned, the more data we have, the more precise we can be on our prediction, on our scenario generation. So there is always a need to improve the situation, of always room for improvement.
what about the EEA side? Do we have enough granular data, or do we look at the bigger picture? What kind of data concerns you might have, Ian?
Yeah, it's a good question, and as Diego and Joachim said, we work very closely with our network of countries. So we work with all of the EU member states and other member countries of the EEA in terms of gathering this data and trying to make sense of it. So there's this difference between data and then the kind of analysis or the intelligence that you can gather from this data. And I think this is the important point in trying to answer that question. So what does this mean? What can we determine from this data? So we're always looking for more data. We're always looking to get data more quickly because we want to be able to respond and be more agile in terms of how we identify where an environmental issue, for example, is occurring. And Joachim, for example, mentioned that modern technology. So we're looking at how we can use, for example, satellite data in terms of getting more or less real-time information on different types of pollution. And this, for example, is used in identifying oil spills at sea, for example, by the European Maritime Safety Agency. So this kind of technology, and we use it as well, for example, for looking at the presence of nutrients in the marine environment. So these kind of technologies can be really powerful in terms of providing other sources of data. Another example is this idea of citizen science, where we get people involved in actually measuring the quality of their own environment themselves. And again, this can be a really powerful source of localized data in terms of, for example, if you think about air quality, in Europe, there's a relatively limited number of monitoring stations, formal or regulatory monitoring stations. But if people are also collecting data as well, this gives us a lot more granular data at a local level in terms of air quality. So these kinds of methodologies can be very useful in terms of increasing the knowledge that we have, and then increasing the intelligence that we can gather about how we're doing in terms of reducing pollution.
Thanks. I'm looking at the incoming questions. There are several that touch upon a few topics, so I'll try to kind of put them together. And they're somehow linked to one of the points that you had raised earlier, Ian, on the consumption and production systems. So there is a question from Jumo Solomon, who is actually asking about the impact on Africa, or we can actually extend this question because there's a similar question from Polina as well, that the EU sends pollution outside its borders or has impacts on beyond its borders. And so Juma is asking, what are some of the environmental policies that we are putting in place in Europe that cut across globally to reduce effects of pollution? And of course, he's more interested in African countries which lack awareness in some of these areas. And Paulina is referring to, again, similar, what are specific policies and legislations that we have in Europe going forward. And if not this kind of global angle, how the problem could be effectively solved in the future. Should we start with you, Joachim?
Yes, happy to do so. So in the Zero Pollution Action Plan, there's a whole section on this. I fully agree that this is an important angle. And what we say basically is that we want to reduce the external pollution footprint, how we call it, of the European Union. So basically the pollution that we, let's say, that we export. And this question of exporting, importing pollution is, I think, is a very, very important one. It's one that is probably been underestimated in the past, but it's also at the same time very difficult to analyze, at least in some areas. So this is probably also interesting to hear from the colleagues a little bit how we are trying to tackle this in terms of the analysis point. I focus in 2 sentences, maybe briefly, on the policies. Obviously, we are working very closely with our international partners, mainly the UN. Our main counterpart in DG Environment is the United Nations Environment Programme. And we're working very closely with them in the context of finding first and foremost global solutions. I'm, of course, delighted, as so many are around the world, that we had an agreement in Montreal, Kunming, which looks at a global framework for biodiversity protection, which also has some important pollution dimensions in there. You will find a target 7 in that agreement, which deals exactly with these type of pollutions. And then, of course, we look at the problem globally. The same thing goes for achieving a global agreement on plastics, that we are actively negotiated, and we are very, very adamant supporters of agreeing on this as soon as possible. So there are many, many areas where we have to work together globally in order to address this. But from the EU itself, we have also a number of policies. I would in particular mention at the moment very intense discussions going on waste shipments. So how do we regulate the waste that goes outside the EU, and what are the conditions? And these are proposals that the European Commission made, but in order for them to become law, they need to be approved by the member states, the European Council, and the European Parliament. And these negotiations are still ongoing, but this is a key instrument to addressing that pollution footprint. And then we're involved in many other areas. I think one topic of emerging concern is what happens with all these batteries and our vehicles when we have a transport transition in the light of climate change, where we have more and more of old vehicles and unused batteries, etc. So again, we're looking into ways of managing that and not having these, let's say, waste problems in the end shipped to outside the EU, so that out of sight, out of mind, so to say. So a lot of areas where we're working on this, but what I find still difficult, and we have really had a lot of discussions, and I'm certainly looking for improvements in the future, how we can analyze these imports and exports as part of our zero pollution monitoring and outlook. It's a real interesting challenge, and I think we started, but we still need to do more on that. Thanks.
So Diego, do you have any kind of data sets or any kind of data that would be relevant for this kind of global analysis that you could see?
Well, actually, we haven't included that yet. As Joaquin was saying, this is not was not contemplated in the first Outlook report, but we do have already something to add on the plastic pollution issue. For example, we made an analysis of whether or not we might be able to achieve the 50% reduction target in the Mediterranean Sea, which everybody knows is a share basin. It has European countries, but also non-European countries. And then we made a couple of simulation analysis, and we found out that it was not possible to achieve this 50% reduction only taking action at the European countries, but we need to involve non-European countries. Also because it is true that there is cross-boundary pollution. So some of the litter that it's produced in European countries might end or will end in non-European beaches, for example, and the opposite is also true. So one of the ambition of the Green Deal is to go beyond the European borders and to make other countries to follow suit our path. And this is a clear example on the need of collaboration, international collaboration beyond the EU borders.
I think for some regions like the Mediterranean Sea and stuff, this is quite evident as well in the cooperation efforts, but also in the legislation or the reflections as well. Ian, anything that you would like to add in terms of the kind of, because a part of the report that, at least from the European Environment Agency side, we publish has got these signals of emerging issues or things that we don't have, I would say, a regular thorough analysis, but.
Yeah, and as it was mentioned, this is the first of these assessments that we've completed, and we will build on this. There's another zero pollution assessment in 2024, so we'll build on this. But one of the areas that we looked at in particular in relation to this topic in our first assessment is this area of resource extraction, or where we get our raw materials from, because as we consume stuff, obviously we need to find new raw materials, or if we move towards a more circular economy, then we can recycle and reuse more materials. But when we talk about resource extraction, a lot of this is around mining. So for example, mining of metals or precious metals that we would be using in things like batteries. So we're increasing our usage of electric vehicles, for example. And these require certain raw materials. Some of these do come from African countries, for example, and one of these signals that we included in the zero pollution monitoring assessment looked at the ranking that's being carried out, which looks at the impact of mining in different countries and how they compare. So we're seeing that there is some data out there internationally in relation to the impacts that mining has and the relative performance of different countries in relation to that. So I think this is an important element that we can try and build on in the next zero pollution assessment as well. Make sure that we try and, as Joachim said, get a better quantification of the impacts that our choices in Europe are having elsewhere. Because if we're increasing demand for these metals, then how do we make sure that they're produced more sustainably? And interestingly as well, we've identified in the assessment that there is actually an increase in the number of new mines being opened in Europe. So obviously, where mines are within the European Union, then they have to comply with the European Union regulations. So that does impose a certain level of performance there. So this is something that we'll be continuing to watch between now and the next report in 2024 as well.
Yes, because actually this package was the first of its kind, in the sense that this is, putting all these efforts from the sources, etc., that to kind of reducing the impact. And then we will be looking at it again.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is historically we've tended to look at pollution within certain sectors or activities. So for example, you look at pollution in relation to industrial production, or you look at pollution in relation to electricity generation. But as we've already discussed, pollution is very much a cross-cutting issue. So we need to look at it more holistically to make sure that we're looking at how pollution moves through the environment or within the environment and between ecosystems and people and how the choices that we make actually impact on pollution. So it's around having that more cross-cutting view of pollution and where it comes from.
I will continue with the questions that we are receiving because we have about 10 minutes ahead of us. There was a question from Sandeep that looks at this global angle, but I think we covered that one. There is one question from René, who talks about consumption behavior, actually. How can those of us who are proactively working to change people's behavior and consumption patterns make you aware of our work and collaborate? And there's also a comment which might be in that kind of sense as well, linked to that discussion about citizen science. And Lehman says that citizen science is also useful to reinforce awareness. So there is already some activity that are undertaken beyond the policy rules and legislation. Is there any opportunity to cooperate or to use this data or to help them to communicate, to raise awareness? Maybe you could talk a little bit about it, Joachim, from the Commission's angle, because public awareness and this kind of change in behavior is something that the Commission and some of the policies also try to facilitate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think it needs to be underlined that change, the transition has to be done together in society with the individuals, with the citizens, with everybody involved. It's not just about a few people in Brussels, Copenhagen, or somewhere else in ISPRA making a few analyses. I think really everybody can do something. That's the good news. And of course, we would be delighted, and that was part of the idea as well, to provide some of the arguments, examples, and motivations why it is good to do something about it at an individual level as well. I'll give you an example: air quality. We have made a lot of progress already on air quality. Why is that? Because a lot of people are reflecting about their mode of transport, for example. Yeah, when you're left with a choice, in particular in urban areas, of which mode of transport you take, you realize, rather than sitting in the car again, if I take the bicycle, I'm not only doing something for the climate agenda, which I think is also very important to say, that a lot of our policies on pollution are very closely linked and create synergies between achieving climate neutrality and reducing pollution. But we are also doing something for reducing air pollution, noise pollution, and we're doing something for ourselves, our health, our fitness. So that is why a lot of people have already chosen to use more bicycles, to use more public transport, and so on and so forth. And of course, all the motivations, initiatives, citizen science was mentioned, all of these things are not only helpful. I think we want to have as many as possible created on the ground to convince more and more people of the benefits of making these non-pollution choices. The same goes for buying products in the supermarkets with less packaging and all these type of things. A lot of things are happening. I think everybody has come across on something already, but this is not because somebody individually has said in Brussels, this is now everybody has to do it. It's because a lot of people on the ground see the reasoning, see the argument, have the data from a report such as the one that we did to underpin the reasons why we need to do something, and then set up some initiatives on the ground. And there are a number of programs. I would say, for instance, the Climate Pact is one of the huge initiatives that we're doing, which looks at promoting such initiatives, such own engagement. So for us, the report is not the only element, but it is certainly a very important element to help all those who are trying to set something up in their neighborhood, so to say, to find the right arguments and give the right reasons why this is necessary.
Yeah. A few other questions. I just want to, make sure that we kind of address them as well. But feel free to add. I'm asking Ian and Diego as well. Feel free to add. But let's just, for our audience sake, take them as well. There is a question actually from Grisel, who is a sustainability professional. What is being done to tackle petrochemical lobbies influencing EU policies? I think that there is a general approach in EU decision making that looks at evidence-based knowledge to determine, as you were saying, about the targets and the data and stuff, and setting targets like that. And there are also rules for lobbies, how they can interact with EU institutions in a transparent and supportive way. Maybe you could very briefly reflect a little bit on that, Joachim. Again,
Absolutely.
as the Commission representative.
Yeah, sure. No, it's. I mean, again, there's a lot to say, but I think in principle, we have since more than 10 years, I think, if I'm not mistaken, a policy on this. With the transparency register being the centerpiece, which now has been also taken up more and more by not only the European Commission, but also European Parliament. The Council is coming more and more on board. And there, I mean, for instance, one very concrete thing is if an organization or even an individual expert is not registered in this transparency register, we normally do not invite them for meetings to expert groups or have them involved in our stakeholder engagement. But then I think what is very important is that all our policies are following a, let's say, quality assurance scheme, I would call it, which is called better regulation, which basically says that our policies have to be based on evidence, and we have to follow a number of steps to ensure that everybody can have a say. So it's a public consultation part. We have various tools. There's an open public consultation, sometimes online, there are meetings, but also there are really a lot of kind of documentation requirements and show, for instance, the letters that we've received from some of these organizations, whether petrochemical or others. And so the whole aspect is organized, is transparent, and then has to be documented when we make, for instance, a new proposal in a so-called impact assessment, where we then laid out the evidence and give, from the European Commission perspective, the way we have used the data and evidence in the policy making. So to say, well, we had different options, we had different pieces of information here and there, and the choices that we made are the following. So that is the part that we are doing, and then of course there are other actors which have their own rules. But I think, as you know, this is a constant topic also in the media, where of course there's then also regular reflections on how we can improve our own systems, so to make sure that we follow the highest standards.
Yeah,
thank you.
But I would actually recommend the viewers to check out one of these open consultations, where it is quite transparent. It is very detailed as well. There is one more question that I would like to just ask. We have very few minutes left on our chat. Maybe just to reflect a little bit on, it's a question from Noelia, and she wants to know how the targets that we mentioned, how achieving them work in practice for member states. So, we talk about reducing, the health impacts of air pollution by this and that %. How does a local authority or a country go about? Any thoughts on that? I don't know, Ian, you've got connections, having come from Irish Environmental Protection Agency, and do you know how the country implements these kind of targets? Yeah,
and obviously within the European Environment Agency as well, we work very closely with IONET, what we call IONET, which is our network of countries. So we work very closely at a country level. But while these targets are that we talk about for the Zero Pollution Action Plan are EU-based, within a lot of the legislation, there is also specific targets for each individual country. So, for example, in relation to emissions of pollutants, such as, for example, ammonia or particulates or other air pollutants, there are specific limits for each individual country as well. So we do publish a lot of data on the EEA website in relation to how countries are doing in terms of achieving these targets. So, for example, countries on those emissions of pollutants have targets for 2030. So they are all managed at a local level by, for example, the relevant ministry or the Environmental Protection Agency or whatever the organization might be in each country. And normally those data are published at a local level as well. So there are different tiers of targets in terms of this high level EU-wide target, but also more specifically at a national level, and sometimes also even at a regional level as well, because one of the key things is that we do see an inequality in terms of exposure to pollution. So for example, we need to be particularly careful for people who work in urban areas, or people or children, for example, who can be more significantly impacted by pollution. So there are targets at different levels across the EU.
And if I may come in,
you want to add something?
Yeah, just because I think it also is helpful to say also what we're planning to do as part of the next steps for the zero pollution monitoring and outlook. We're also looking a little bit whether we can translate this EU level and in some cases we already, as Ian said, have national level kind of information into a regional and local level. So we just actually are discussing to launch a project to see, can we zoom in and out? I mean, it's from a data point of view not so trivial, but it would really be our vision that at some point in the future, from this work that we're doing here together and with the Zero Pollution Action Plan as the driving force, that we don't have only the EU discussion and target, but that every citizen can actually then go in to the systems that we have and zoom through and say, okay, we have in the European level, we're going in this direction, but what does it mean for my city? What does it mean for my region? And is it any different of what we need to do to go into the good direction? So I think for me, as we said earlier, is the starting point what we did now, but we're really learning a lot, and that's why I want to encourage everybody also to feed back to us what they think about the report, because we can really learn a lot from your feedback to also direct us when we do updates and the next editions of this exercise. Thank you.
Any last comments to add, Diego?
Just would like to say that even if there is a lot of work to be done still, and there is a lot of improvement to be done, for many of the pollution or the pollutants in Europe, we are already doing a lot to fight them, and the situation it's improving. Maybe not that as much as we would like to, or the pace is not as fast as possible. But we are for many aspects we are on a good direction.
Track.
Yeah, good track. And then we need to do more, but we are not that bad at all.
That's good. So in some ways, pollution is local, but also global. But definitely taking action pays off, and there's still quite a bit of work ahead of us, and it's a long-term perspective, long-term trajectory, but we'll get there, right? Anything to add, Ian, just as a very briefly, because we're already over time also?
Yeah, no, it's been really interesting, and it will be, I mean, we could probably do with another hour to chat through. There's so many other issues that we haven't addressed. I mentioned briefly this issue of inequality and the fact that people are not all exposed to the same level of pollution. And I think this is a really important issue that we need to make sure we monitor and address over the next number of years. So that's something that we have a particular focus on in the group that I work with. So for example, this year we're looking at the impacts of pollution on children in particular, and we'll be publishing something on that. So that element of inequality is important, and I think overall it's about how we can move towards a much more sustainable way of living and consuming and producing and managing our lifestyles from that perspective. So we're looking forward to working on the next version of the report, which will be produced in 2024.
Very good. And Joachim, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think we've covered a lot, but we could also, as Ian says, continue for quite some while. I think we're all very passionate about the topic. So for me, as colleagues have said, it's just a start. And there's lots to do, but we're very encouraged with that. And I can only call again on all those who are still listening that this is an interactive process. We're really keen to have feedback. Any reflections, any ideas, any suggestions will only help us to make this product stronger and better and more useful as we go along. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of our viewers, I'd like to thank you for all your contributions. I'd like to thank the team behind and definitely our viewers for your interesting and enlightening questions. We'll be back with other Ask an Expert sessions in coming weeks, so you'll find us on our LinkedIn page again. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.